Aaron, how are you?
Good. Season 7.
Season 7.
Can you believe it?
I mean, I know how facts work,
Okay.
but otherwise it's challenging, sure.
I like organizing these into seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the state of the podcast,
Healthy?
it's healthy.
I think so.
All right. I think I'm still having fun. You?
Yeah.
Let's do some more.
All right, let's do some more.
All right. As we clued.
Yeah.
Teed up
Teed up.
at
Also-
the end of the last season.
Yeah.
We are doing. We're starting this season here with American Zion.
Yeah. New book by Benjamin E. Park.
Benjamin E. Park, and so I had an introduction for how I thought we could kind of proceed.
Okay.
Have you seen the television show Parks and Rec?
Yes, actually, I have.
Okay.
I'm so glad you picked a TV show I've seen.
It's great, right?
It is good, yeah. I like it.
Have you heard of the podcast Parks and Recollection?
I have. I listened to one episode while I was washing dishes once.
There you go. The format of that show, right?
I don't remember.
Well,
Sorry.
what they do is they're reviewing episodes.
And they're talking about who was guest starring and who wrote it. And stuff that happened on set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of
sort of
behind the scenes
Yeah.
stuff, right? But they also just talk generally about the episode and like what's kind of going through. And I don't know, man. I kind of feel like we could do a similar pattern here
Okay.
as we read through this book. Like, here's what I'm trying to get at. And I felt like when we did books in the past,
Yeah.
right? When we've done these, we've kind
Yes.
of been. I felt like I've been learning a ton,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
But this book, is kind of different to me because I feel like I'm in really familiar ground,
Especially with chapter 1.
especially with chapter 1, and it is. And so I've learned a bunch of interesting things about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we should talk about, right? But I haven't found the crazy controversy yet that we've sunk our teeth into, or the difficult to answer question.
Well,
But I know we're gonna get them in the subsequent chapters.
yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, if you consider the name of our podcast
Yeah.
and the first episode and our whole reason for existence,
Yeah.
a lot of the stuff in chapter 1 probably is controversial for some people and worth talking about.
Okay.
I mean, personally, I don't think I learned anything from chapter 1,
Uh-huh.
which I don't want to come off like a snob, but and there was stuff that I didn't know 2 years ago in that chapter, and there's a lot of stuff I didn't know 10 years ago.
Maybe
But
that's my point.
I think as we go on, there's going to be more and more I don't know.
I feel like after 7 years, maybe my point is that I
Yeah.
feel like after 7 years of doing this with you, that I've learned a ton,
Uh-huh.
right? And that about the church and about the church history, and I still am learning things here. But when we did our very first episode, The Man with His Face in His Hat,
Yeah.
to me that moment was really really revelatory in the sense that it was not I didn't understand the seer stones thing,
Yeah.
and putting the face in the hat thing, right? And so that was all very new to me. It's just funny when I reread it. This content this time, it feels familiar,
Yeah.
right? In a way that it didn't before. I really appreciated that. But I think it's going to change a bit how I approach like doing the episodes on it. So
Mhm.
I'm going to feel more reviewy, right? And more
Okay.
like trying to talk about what I found, right?
Okay. I think
It's-
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a useful way to frame it.
So the church has been releasing the new histories, Saints.
Yeah.
The fourth one is either out now or coming out real soon, and then it will be complete. I tried to read the first one. I couldn't get into it. Not because the writing wasn't good. The writing's great. I think it's a great introduction to church history. But kind of like chapter 1 of American Zion, I sort of knew it all. I mean, I didn't know absolutely everything, all the details, all the exact things people said, but it wasn't quite that exciting. I just have a lot of grounding in the Joseph Smith era. I know it. But I'm reading Saints Volume 3 right now, and it's kind of nonstop thrills.
Uh-huh.
Because although I know a lot of the names, I don't know what's going on in the church in 1920 in the way that I do about 1820.
So I'm just a little bit behind. I'm just behind you then.
Mhm.
Because there are definitely were thrills for me in reading this first
Yeah,
chapter.
so I'm excited to experience those vicariously, but I guess what I'm saying is I anticipate
Yeah.
the thrill quotient to increase when we get past the Joseph Smith era or maybe past the Brigham Young era, but probably even just starting in chapter 2, there will be a higher percentage of things that I didn't know ahead of time.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should have started with this, but what is this book?
Yeah, so this is...
And why did we want to do it?
Well, we like Ben Park. We have cited him on the show a number of times. Also, I learned when I went to the... You were there too, weren't you? Did you go to the signing? And when you did the fireside?
I got sick.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I was so bummed.
Yeah, so yours isn't signed.
I know.
But it was kind of exciting to find out that Ben had read some of my stuff, which because he's kind of a bigger deal than I am, so that was flattering. But it's the first single volume history of the church in a little over a decade. And in that decade, a lot of sources have become available that were not available back a decade ago. Okay. And so Benjamin Park has written this new single volume history of the church. It's called American Zion because it is kind of focused on the concept of the church and America sort of intertwined. I wrote thesis next to this line in the prologue where he says, telling the story of how the people who long to create Zion built one of the most powerful institutions in the nation reveals much about not only the history of Mormonism, but also the culture out of which it arose.
So that's the part that I didn't really know much about. The culture out of which it arose. Okay?
Yeah.
This was very exciting to me.
I remember being excited when I learned some. So I think I know what you might be talking about. I feel bad. I didn't know you didn't know it, Aaron. I would have told you. Would you like to taste the orange juice?
So, yeah, well, we're going to start with chapter 1, unless you have stuff from the prologue.
I do have one other thing, or maybe 2 other things from the prologue I'd like to mention. For instance, he makes this great observation. It occurred to me, this is in Ben Park's voice, that if Mormonism was characterized by a cacophony of divergent voices in the present day, it had likely been so for some time. Today, as a professor of American religious history, I know that the history of Mormonism has in fact been contested from the very start. At the very first meeting, the revelation came, keep a record. And ever since then, there's been some disagreement on how it happens. In fact, one thing that blew my mind in the prologue was that Brigham Young collected every copy he could get of Lucy Mack Smith's biography of her family, focusing on her son Joseph Smith, and had them destroyed. What? That is shocking.
That was in the prologue? I can't remember.
That was in the prologue, yeah. And another thing that Joseph Smith said, all is not gold that shines, although all is not gold that shines, by proving contraries, truth is made manifest, and I've always loved that line. You got to go back.
Okay. Why did she destroy? I read the prologue like a month ago. Why did she destroy
Brigham Young destroyed.
Why did he destroy those?
So he came to feel that the work was a threat to his own authority.
Okay.
So
Brigham Young is going to be a very interesting character.
I can't wait for that chapter because of Brigham Young. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh, there were other things that I learned. For instance, did you know that the first congregation in Ohio was led by a black man? I didn't know that.
That's cool.
And I thought that a lot of those little tidbits there's been so much light shown on them in the last 10 years, I kind of thought I knew them all. Everything that was available, and not so. Anyway, Joseph Smith, and I do love this line. We've probably talked about it on the show before. Although all is not gold that shines, by proving contraries, truth is made manifest. And he says, in other words, it is through the spirit of competition, the alchemy of refinement, that a people is formed. Speaking of which, we had a guest speaker.
Wait. Interpret that sentence, though. The spirit of refinement is the...
Yeah, so I'm gonna speak about something that happened on Sunday in hopes that it helps clarify this. We were visited by Thomas Griffith. He's a friend of a couple people in our ward. He's not a member of our ward, but he was visiting and he was asked to speak in sacrament. The ward council decided not to tell people who Thomas Griffith was, just he was a friend of someone. But do you know?
No, I didn't know that.
He is former district judge on the DC court. He
really?
He was on Joe Biden's commission to suggest reforms for the Supreme Court.
Really?
Yeah, he
his talk was so good.
It was so good. and he told the story about giving the Supreme Court a tour of the DC temple before it was rededicated.
Okay, I thought that was awesome, but now it makes more sense.
Yeah, and so he's a really interesting guy. Look up his Wikipedia page. He's a very interesting fellow. Anyway, one of the things he said, I think it was then and not at the fireside the night before. If you remember, we'll know it was during church. But he said it's really important that there's disagreement. It's through proving contraries the truth is made manifest. To quote Joseph Smith again, it's by disagreeing with each other. If you just go to ward council, since I've already mentioned it, and everybody just agrees with the bishop and that's the end of the story, you're not arriving at the best possible solution. The same thing should be happening in Congress or on a court. Same thing should be happening. He quoted the address on South Temple where the apostles meet. I don't know. I can't quote the address, but he just mentioned the address. Like, there should be disagreement in all places where decisions are made so that we can make sure that we're considering all possibilities and arriving at the best possible conclusion. And I kind of love that for a church, this is one of the contradictions, I guess, and the paradoxes of being a Latter-day Saint, but we believe in revelation from God, which is, pretty definitive, but we also very much believe in this idea of proving contraries and like a sort of democratic arrival at decisions and counseling together in our councils as we are counseled to do.
Well, and boy howdy, are there not contradictions in this first chapter.
Yeah. Ready to dive in? I think I've covered everything from the prologue that I wanted to mention.
Yeah, the prologue is very good. And the book isn't that expensive. It's on Amazon. You could pick it up. You could follow along with us, or you can...
I'm sure your library has it. And if not, they'll buy it if you request it.
Okay, so I had a couple bits pulled out from the first few sections of the first chapter that I wanted to notice.
Okay, I'm going to let you drive, and because
maybe let's give a broad summary first. So the first chapter is called
A Visionary Nation, 1775 to 1830.
1775 is the first thing I wanted to notice. So this chapter covers a ton of history.
Yeah, almost.
Now, of course, it drills in a lot more deep.
It starts
in the
about
Joseph
30
Smith
years
area.
before Joseph Smith is born.
But
Talks about his ancestors and the places where they lived and what it was like there.
And so during that time, it's between 1775 and 1830, the prophet Joseph Smith was born. He translated the Book of Mormon, and he established the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yes. Although it wasn't called that then.
It was called the Church of Christ first.
Yeah.
So the chapter essentially takes us through that moment of founding the church.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's a whirlwind.
It's a whirlwind of things that happened. But what it also does, as you're saying, is it goes back and talks about this ancestry, right?
Yeah.
But I actually wanted to start with the chapter quotes because I'm finding the chapter quotes to be...
You mean the little epigraph at the top of the chapter?
Is that what you... I so much enjoy being with you, Eric. Just getting little words like that is just so much fun.
Well, I'm happy to be of service.
There's also a note on names and narratives that talks about the usage of the word Mormon.
Yeah.
Which is really good to read. Because he talks about why he uses the word Mormons all over the book. Yeah. Right when President Nelson has asked us to use the full church name.
Right.
So, it's because the quick answer is that because he's an historian, he's operating in the role of historian here.
Yes.
Ben Park. So I'm going to come back to that point later. From the prologue that says, "Have you heard of the All-American prophet? He founded a brand new book about Jesus Christ. We're following him to paradise. We call ourselves Mormons, and our new religion is All-American." And what I love about this is that it's the very, very first part of the prologue of this history, and he's quoting the Book of Mormon musical, which is in itself one of these contradictions that is so that you mentioned before.
Yeah, I mean, we've only made it through chapter 1, but the one at the beginning of the book is by Edward Tullidge, who is not a Latter-day Saint.
The quote to the
quote, yeah. And then the Book of Mormon musical for the prologue, and then for A Visionary Nation, it's Alexander Campbell, who did not like Joseph Smith. They were contemporaries, and he...
Why don't you go ahead and read that quote from Alexander Campbell.
The prophet Smith, through his stone spectacles, wrote on the plates of Nephi and the Book of Mormon every error and almost every truth discussed in New York for the last 10 years. He decides all the great controversies: infant baptism, ordination, the Trinity, regeneration, repentance, justification, the fall of man, the atonement, transubstantiation, fasting, penance, church government, religious experience, the call to the ministry, the general resurrection, eternal punishment, who may baptize, and even the question of Freemasonry, Republican government, and the rights of man.
Alexander Campbell didn't like Joseph Smith, you're
saying? That is correct.
Tell me about that.
If you give me a second, let me check the index, because he was mentioned in chapter 1, so I will...
Yep, this is footnote 1 of chapter 1, and chapter 1, of course, has 94 footnotes, if I remember the number right.
Most of them just references, but there were a few that were worth reading. I am keeping a second bookmark at the footnotes. So I can remember, okay, 44, I gotta come back for 44, that's when he's gonna say something else back here. Disciples of Christ Minister Alexander Campbell declared that he would as soon compare a bat to the American eagle, a mouse to a mammoth, and equate the Book of Mormon to the Bible.
Yeah, that's the quote that's in chapter 1.
Yeah, and he's gonna show up again at the very beginning of chapter 2, so we'll leave that for a future time, I suppose.
Yeah. But your point that these quotes are secular.
The first 3 have been.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, maybe they'll continue. Maybe they'll change later.
Chapter 2 is Brigham Young, so
there you go.
So I guess they will not always follow that pattern.
But what I like about that is this historianness that is being demonstrated, right?
Explain.
By bringing in sources from inside and outside the church.
Okay.
Right? I think that the job of an historian is to be comprehensive. You know, Ben Park, we're not on first name basis, Dr. Park, he is...
I'm happy to pretend.
He is a, believing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, from what we understand.
I believe that's true. Yes.
Yeah. And so, but he's approaching this, and I hate to say it, because it's maybe a bit of a trope, he's approaching it scientifically, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why we like him on the show, I guess.
Yeah.
Not to be predictable. But he talks a little bit about that in the name and the narratives, too. Like,
go ahead.
How the rhetoric of history needs to... Well, I mean, he's trying to respect what people want, right? So at times I mimic the Latter-day Saint community's tradition of referring to those outside the faith as Gentiles. That's because it's necessary to understand how they were thinking. But at the same time... how do we refer to Native Americans, or how do we refer to these people or those people? Like, it's you can't keep everybody happy, so you need to have a rhetorical stance that you can apply consistently and fairly, and that people can understand and predict as the book goes along, so that they're not. Hopefully, readers aren't distracted by choices like he said Mormon here, because we understand why he made the choice, and we can just see how it fits into the text as a whole.
There's other examples of him, in my opinion, exercising historicity, for lack of a better term. For example, in this, there's a paragraph on page 15 where Dr. Park is describing visions that Lucy Mack Smith had, who was Joseph Smith's mother, right? About how she would have 2 trees, right, which represented her...
her husband and his brother.
Her husband and her brother. And one would not bend and one would bend, right? And that meant to her that Jesse, the brother, would never accept the true church when he found it, right? But the one that bent, Joseph
Sr.,
Joseph Smith Sr., the flexible tree, would, right? And here's the quote. Though it is impossible to gauge how much these remembered visions were shaped by the ensuing decades, it is clear that the Smith household adamantly believed in divine intervention outside official channels.
Yes.
And this is the part that I'm trying to get at. This sentence, impossible to gauge, what he's doing is he's not only showing us where the narrative is, but he's also showing us where it isn't.
Yeah.
Saying that in his research, he didn't find a source that talked credibly, I'm just inferring here based on this sentence, about Lucy Mack Smith's understanding of her own visions and,
at those earlier times.
Whether they shaped, their later, experiences, right? But it is clear that they believed in divine intervention, is what he says.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the framework that we get to see from this. That's historicity is an interesting word, right? Because my understanding of its meaning is accurate reporting of the past. Was that a good way to describe it, or is there more to it?
Well, I mean, so one thing that I think a lot about is this quotation I read from the Renaissance scholar Ada Palmer, which I happen to know you have in front of you due to a pause in our recording. Would you be so kind as to read that?
Yeah, so this is from Ada Palmer's article.
It's an article about her. It's more about her work as a fantasy author than as a Renaissance scholar, but still, she is a Renaissance scholar. She's a big deal.
She is fond of saying that we know less than 1% of what happened 500 years ago, and at least 2/3 of what we know is wrong.
Right. So it's hard to be a historian. so little stuff survives. And what does survive, you have to work your way through, and you have to figure out how it fits together, and you have to figure out what's serious and what's not serious, and what's right and what's wrong, and when somebody was being sarcastic. And then, so even the tiny bit you know, you may be getting it wrong. So you have to bring a lot of humility to the job of historian. So when we're talking about historicity and him not reading too much into what the evidence suggests, I feel like that's actually a major portion of being a good historian, is not just collecting the data, but then being careful not to make big assumptions, which, as you say, is a scientific way to think.
Yay. I hadn't heard about this illness that Lucy Mack Smith had.
Oh, I've forgotten. What did it say about that?
So this is early in chapter 1.
Oh, wait, yes, I do remember. This is on page 13. This is when she was young.
Yeah.
Yeah, she nearly died, and she made a deal with God, basically.
Yeah, which was really interesting. The deal was, quote, if God would let me live, I would endeavor to get that religion that would enable him to serve him right. And then she heard a voice that quoted scripture and promised salvation.
I believe that story is in Saints, but I first read it when I read her history. That was the first I heard of it.
So he didn't get all the copies, is what you're saying?
He didn't get all the copies. We still have them. And there's a new version out that is supposed to be closer to what she actually wrote. I have not read that one, but I don't know how different it is.
This is one of the first parts of this first part of the story that really introduces one of the things that I didn't really know about. Now, growing up in the church, of course I knew about Joseph Smith and the... How do you say it? The controversies in religion at the time?
Sure.
The myriad of disagreements that led him to read in James 1, chapter 5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. Right?
Right. Great Awakening, burned over district, all those terms.
I had never heard the term burned over district.
Oh, that's a good one.
Okay, and that comes from the fact that area that they were in, the Smith family, had a lot of hellfire preachers in it.
Yeah, a lot of preachers showing up, having big events. People get excited, and then somebody else comes to town.
But what I was going to say is that how many visionaries there were, right?
I feel like the way Sunday school was taught, and when we were kids, and maybe still is that Joseph Smith is special. And not to say he isn't special, but he's not the only person in his family having visions. His mother has them. Grandparents had them. They're a visionary family.
This is kind of the introduction to the magic that is really part of the early part of Joseph Smith.
Right, because it's in the air. There were lots of people who were having visions and saying they saw Jesus. Joseph Smith is a bit more literal than most of them, but people are seeing Jesus and talking with Jesus and having a lot of the things that happened to Joseph Smith have happened to other people at this time. This is not such a crazy thing.
Yeah. Which was surprising to me. My understanding of the first vision was Joseph Smith had this amazing experience, and he went and talked to a bunch of people about it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people refused to believe him, and some people did, right? But it was novel and new. But it wasn't novel, and it wasn't new. There were so many people having visions like this. What, of course, was novel and was new was the Book of Mormon. That was really different from based on what I remember reading in the chapter.
Yeah.
The Book of Mormon is like bananas.
In
how different it is from like other scripture.
Does not behave the way the other things people were writing were behaving either.
Yeah.
And also it shows up at a time where the religionists are starting to push back against this a little too democratic distribution of revelation and excitement.
Yeah, exactly. Which was also interesting to read about. Okay, so that's my first point, is that this was already in a visionary place. But the other thing that I really enjoyed was learning about how deep the magic went, right? The seer stone, the treasure hunters, right? And this association that Joseph Smith was in. I might be skipping over too much of the chapter if we talk about that.
No, I think we're fine jumping around. I mean, I don't remember if I've recommended it on the podcast before, but there's a great book called The Glass Looker. Mm-hmm. It's a comic book, and what the...
you have mentioned it before, but I never understood the reference. And just so folks know, Joseph Smith was put on trial, right?
Yes.
In a case called The People versus Joseph Smith, The Glass Looker, right?
Yeah.
And so this is when he was super seer stoning around in his kind of early life.
Yeah, and so what I was going to say is that in The Glass Looker, what he does is he takes all the stories of Joseph Smith that we still have, and he doesn't judge them based on whether historians think they're true or false. He just turns each one into a story as it is. And so sometimes Joseph Smith is a cripple, sometimes he's the strongest kid in town. People told different stories. But that's where I first met Sally Chase, who has taught Joseph Smith how to use a seer stone. And she's really pretty in the book. Let's just get that out there. But also, she's just such an interesting character, and I would love to know more about Sally Chase, but there's just not much out about her.
Okay.
But she's a very interesting person, and I'm glad she got at least a mention here.
Let's just pause for a second. The person who taught Joseph Smith how to use a seer stone. If you think about like Star Wars, let's go back to Star Wars, 1977, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi teaches Luke how to use a lightsaber, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge part of the movie.
Yeah.
It's the hero's journey, that part where you're learning, right?
Yeah.
Am I misremembering the hero's journey?
Yeah. The wise old man.
The wise old person comes and gives you something and teaches you how to do something.
Yeah.
Sally
Chase.
Sally Chase. It's vital, as you say. And yeah, it's so interesting that we don't. Not only do we not know much about her, but she's not really part of the Sunday school histories either, right?
She's a woman.
I think it's really okay.
No, I'm not saying that's why she's not Sunday school. I just think it's interesting that Joseph Smith learned this skill from a woman.
Yeah. But I guess what I was going to say was Joseph Smith learning to use a seer stone is an interesting statement, right?
Yeah.
Because what does it imply? It implies that the object itself is functional.
Yeah.
Right? And we talked about this on our first episode of the show. Right?
Yeah.
That the object itself has power. And
we talked about that with Tanner when he was on our show about how objects can have power.
That's right. That was about Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that idea that objects have power is not particularly what I would say a modern day LDS idea. Right?
No.
It was God that gave Joseph Smith power to use the seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't that God gave the seer stone power and Joseph Smith was able to use it.
But when Martin Harris swaps out the seer stone, it doesn't work.
That's so cool!
He finds a stone that looks the same and Joseph doesn't know what's gone wrong.
Yeah. I think I'd heard that story before, but that was also a really cool story.
Yeah. It's a great story.
All right.
It raises really interesting questions. It might have just been that Martin Harris decided to test and God decided to, okay, we'll do this test. Mm-hmm. Or maybe the stone is not the same as other stones in some fundamental way that we can't understand.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's that idea is just as bananas to me as it was 7 years ago when we started this show.
I mean, it seems like only anti-Mormons now refer to temple garments as magic underwear.
Yeah.
But 30 years ago, Mormons sometimes would call it that too. And we've talked about when Gordon B. Hinckley was on 60 Minutes, and one of the people they interviewed, I want to say it was the Marriott they interviewed, but anyway, one of the famous Mormons they interviewed in the show talked about how he was in a boat accident but he wasn't burned where his garments were. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, I've heard that story.
Yeah, and there used to be lots of stories told like that. So the idea of magical objects is not that distant in our past.
Yeah.
I wonder if we looked harder if we could still find some.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about treasure. Where do we go from here?
Whatever strikes you.
There
was a lot of treasure digging. Joseph Smith was hired as someone. That's how we met Emma. He was hired to go work on a treasure hunt as the person who could find treasure, and that's how we met Emma.
So part of the treasure hunting stories I knew about, right? Mm-hmm. So just to recap, Joseph Smith, when he was younger, he found his first seer stone. Probably the same one, I guess, that Sally Chase taught, or maybe a different one. But he had one that was like his. Yeah. And there's a picture of it in the book, and you can find it online as well.
Yeah.
They call it the chocolatey looking stone. To me, it kind of looks like a tiger eye.
It does kind of, but not as glossy.
Yeah. So, and I love tiger eyes, and I always have.
Maybe if they stuck it in a tumbler, it could get glossy.
Maybe.
I'll recommend that to the church history department.
There you go. You don't want to rub the. Yeah. You don't want to change. You don't want to ship a Theseus.
Nobody's going to use it anyway. What does it matter?
How do we know they're not using it? What are you talking about?
That's fair. That's fair.
Just put that conspiracy theory away. Forget that. Okay, my point is that because I don't know what people. Okay, people should understand that was a joke.
As far as we know.
Okay, so but my point was that, okay, so he became involved with a society of treasure seekers.
Yeah.
That were his colleagues.
And those are the people.
And that were his friends.
Yeah, and
right?
he worked with them, and then he left that club behind.
And when he left that club behind, he essentially betrayed them.
That's how it felt. Yeah.
That's how it felt to them.
Because they had a deal. You find something, you share it.
You find something, you share it. And so when he got the gold plates, they weren't just wanting them for money.
Yeah.
These were his buddies that he had said, "I'm sorry,
That's fair play.
I can't be with you guys anymore."
That's not how it works. We had a deal.
We had a deal.
We had a deal. We've been buying these lottery tickets at lunch every Friday. We leave the office, we go buy a lottery ticket every Friday.
Yeah.
And just because I was sick, I don't get a cut.
That was an aspect of this development of Joseph Smith's history that I didn't understand, because when you read about like the enemies that were trying to get a hold of the Mormons in the history books, they're oftentimes faceless, nameless mobs.
Right.
Right? But it wasn't the case. This group of people were mad at Mormons because they were also treasure hunters that were trying to get the book that Joseph Smith had.
And he cheated them.
Yeah, and essentially, to their minds, he cheated them, even though he was doing what God told him.
He's trying to reform. And it also gives new understanding to when he talked about how he fell into error between the first vision and Moroni. You realize, like, oh, well, I mean...
Because he was a treasure hunter.
He didn't just laugh too loud. He was a bit of a treasure hunter.
When Joseph Smith had to go back to get the plates 4 times, right? The first time he actually got them out of the box that they were buried in. And
which I did not know
Which I did not either.
More recently,
Yeah. More recently than the book? Or because I learned that from the book.
When did I learn that? Not long ago.
Okay. So he pulls the plates actually gets them out of the box, turns around and they're back in the box or something like that. He couldn't get the plates, right? And it was because he was still in this treasure hunting mindset.
Yeah, the line isn't quoted here, but I've read before where Joseph Smith said that as he was getting them, he was thinking about the indigent circumstances of his family and how, a big pile of gold could help them. Yeah. It's amazing how incongruous it is to me, right? This treasure hunter aspect of Joseph's life, right? With the appearance of angels and Moroni and God, the eternal Father, and the treasure hunting like stuff is weird. It mentions in passing here that he didn't do it. He failed a lot at it. Yeah, he wasn't super good at it. But I mean, they had treasure hunters often. In fact, you know how in the Book of Mormon treasure is slippery? Yeah. That's also true for treasure hunters in Joseph Smith's time. Treasure would be slippery, and as you're looking at it, it would move, and as you're digging holes, it would slip away to another location. And that was something people accepted was an aspect of treasure, and one of the reasons it's hard to find. And there's some weird stuff, too. Like, in at least one of the stories, they, have to kill a rooster in order for the magic to work so they can find the treasure, and so... That was in the book. They, slit that got mentioned in passing. Some chicken's throat. Yeah, and so it's... I mean, what they would call, I don't know what they would call it, but we might call that, that looks like old-timey witchcraft or something. But, because it's not, it's not exactly what we imagine. So, it's not Tom Sawyer going out and, walking through a cave hoping treasures are. So I knew a bunch about this treasure hunting stuff, of course. Yeah. But what I didn't really understand was that it was the journey from treasure hunting to wanting to get the Book of Mormon for the Book of Mormon's sake, to do God's commandments. That was the 4-year journey that he went through. The first time he went by himself. The next few years he went with this other person. Alvin. He went with Alvin. But he also then, when Alvin died, because he was poisoned? I didn't know that. By his doctor. Doctor? That's actually just something I learned 6 months ago. Alvin Smith, Joseph Smith's eldest brother, was mercury poisoned? Yeah. Why did his doctor poison him? Because medicine was not very good. And it was a tragedy. He was the primary breadwinner. He was kind of the man of the family. The man of the family, and that's why they were so poor at that point. Okay, anyway, so when Alvin died, Joseph Smith went with this other person who was one of these treasure hunting people. And then he kept feeling more and more that he had to distance himself from that group. So that's why on the last trip, when he actually got the plates, he didn't go with any of those people. He went with Emma instead. Yeah.
which I also don't think that I remembered that it was Emma that went with him on the fourth trip.
The last time she was there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Emma... I need to read a full biography of Emma someday because she's just so interesting.
She's so interesting.
The more you read about her, the stronger and more impressive she becomes.
And there's pieces of that here in the book, and that's one of the other points I wanted to talk about. I wanted to spend some time.
Brigham Young was so threatened by her.
But okay, we're going to learn more about that in the next chapter or two.
I imagine, yes.
Yeah, but Emma went with Joseph Smith to get the Book of Mormon.
Yeah,
I think that's really cool.
They had a real partnership.
I feel like that would have been something I had heard in the past.
Seems likely.
But it was at least reminded to me at this point. There's a quote about Emma Smith that I'd love to read about her in the Book of Mormon, about the plates.
Okay, let's hear it.
Once the newlyweds moved into a small home that had been recently vacated by Emma's brothers, the plates were left on a table while wrapped in a linen cloth. Emma, though tempted, never uncovered them, though she traced their exterior with her fingers. Quote, they seemed to be pliable, like thick paper, quote, she recalled. Quote, and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, end quote. So yeah, I'd never really understood palpably how, I mean, she was the original scribe, of course.
The original scribe.
And,
most of the
but
116 pages.
She just lived with these day by day, never lifted the sheet to peek under there to see what was what was under there.
Did you peek at your Christmas presents?
I did one year.
Yeah.
Oh, if my mom's listening, she might be mad now. I would have been, Mom, for your reference, this was on Maxine. I don't know if I've ever told her, but I think I might have been 6 or 7, and I totally peeked up at all the presents. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and it kind of was terrible. They probably knew. This is probably not surprising to them. Okay, so let's see more comments on Emma, if there are any.
Well, she's also, I wouldn't call her visionary, but she's also, when Joseph meets her, she has a reputation of being a spiritual powerhouse.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And that's part of what makes them a good match. And part of the reason why she's willing to leave her family, because, like, Joseph Smith doesn't have good prospects. He might be charming, but he's kind of a weirdo. And if you listen to the stuff he says,
he's failed to find the treasure that he was hired for.
Right. He's
this guy named, what was it, Solomon or something?
They felt kind of ripped off.
They felt kind of, like he was hired to come. He was paid money to come find a silver mine.
Yeah.
And failed to do it.
This shady guy wants to date my daughter.
Yeah. And I think they married really without his permission.
They did. Yeah, they eloped.
Yeah. Man. So many interesting parts to this. This book is really a kind of a sampler that could maybe get someone interested in deeper histories.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that's the value of a one-volume history, right? You get a lot of interesting stuff and a lot of footnotes. So if you want to, read more, you have senses of where to go.
Okay, so I had another quote as to this journey, right, that changed him to be more sober and less magical. Right? Mm-hmm. So this is on page 24, and this is referring to that trial. All right? This trial, right, is about him being put on, he's put on trial for
glass looking,
but mainly fulfilling to
it wasn't because he was a glass looker.
For being a disorderly person, for claiming to be using a seer stone while seeking buried treasure.
Yeah. Culture's decided we're not into that anymore.
Mm-hmm. And if he was found guilty in that, I've been quoting here a little bit. If he was found guilty, he would be sentenced up to 60 days in jail. Interestingly, the official outcome of that trial is we don't know what happens, right? But quote from again Dr. Park's voice, the Bainbridge episode. I guess this is referring to that trial.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Was a turning point for the wandering seeker. Until 1826, Smith was focused on supernatural quests to discover lost treasure, an occupation deeply rooted in family and culture, but increasingly at odds with the new skeptical generation, anxious to rid themselves of their folkloric origins.
Yes.
Smith was now forced to reorient his priorities and reassess his abilities according to standards of respectability. His understanding of the yet-to-be-uncovered plates shifted accordingly. So again, this is one of the things that I appreciated, this learning more about this transition of Joseph Smith. Even back then, they were starting to shed these folklore, which even all the way back in the early 1800s.
Well, there's the line earlier in the chapter about Thomas Jefferson, who in 1822 he said, "There's not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian."
Yeah.
And Unitarians not being big into miracles and supernatural stuff. He was wrong.
Yeah.
We're still not all Unitarians. Although I drove past the Unitarians on my way to your house.
There you go.
But yeah, there's I mean, it's part of the Enlightenment, right? It's, speaking of the Renaissance, it's part of the Renaissance. Like we're and it never really ends. We're always reconfiguring what's important and what kind of epistemologies we want to use to walk through this world.
Okay. So I think I'm going to keep going through stuff I learned.
Sure.
And
I'm having fun.
Okay. So one thing that I had learned is that the Hill Cumorah had been searched previously. And I think this is one of the reasons why they went at midnight to go get the plates, Emma and Joseph Smith, is that they were like trying to beat other treasure hunters there or something.
Yeah, it did say something about that.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. I wonder if anybody's ever radared that hill. I'm sure they have.
I would imagine.
Yeah. I noticed a big difference between... Yeah, or LiDAR. There you go.
Yeah.
I noticed that they made a distinction between the word peepin' and the word seeing.
Yeah.
On page 25.
Yeah.
I thought that was a cool quote.
It's always good to have two names for things,
Mm-hmm.
so that the same thing can be respectable if one name goes bad.
Smith continued to cultivate some of his seership powers, but they were now framed in an explicitly religious quest. Peepin was all darn... all nonsense.
Yeah.
He explained to Emma's brother Alva, but the gift in seeing with a stone was from God. Okay, so that's kind of the early history stuff I wanted to kind of talk about. At this point in the narrative, Benjamin Park turns to the Book of Mormon itself, and how interesting a book it is. I don't know that we want to spend as much time on that.
We've talked about it before. It would be another episode just to summarize what we've done before.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's like you said before, it's an amazing book, and it really is different. There were a couple moments in that summary, though, that I thought were really interesting, and I think some of them I might actually use in my seminary lesson coming up in a couple weeks on Samuel the Lamanite.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Book of Mormon, we have the Nephites and the Lamanites, right? And so what Ben Park is doing here is putting the Lamanites versus Nephites thing in kind of the larger American context in which the Book of Mormon was translated. And this is on page 33. He said, "The text of the Book of Mormon laid a foundation for early Mormonism's complicated racial views." I thought this paragraph was very interesting.
Yes.
Okay. "When the righteous Nephites separate from the wicked Lamanites, the former are described as white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, while the latter are given a skin of blackness. The Lamanites are described with racist stereotypes, right? Scantily clothed, idolatrous, and fundamentally uncivilized, right? I've lately started to take a bit of umbrage to the word civilized, by the way. Okay. "Yet they do not always fulfill the role of villains, and at times are even more righteous than the Nephites. One of the book's most powerful prophets, Samuel the Lamanite, is reminiscent of the..." And now we have to...
I think it's Pequot.
Pequot?
But I'm afraid I'm wrong. I don't know if I know that or I've just read the word and believe I know it.
The Pequot activist William Apnes, a Methodist minister famous for calling white America to repentance. All right?
That was interesting.
It's really interesting.
That actually was something I learned. I did learn something from chapter 1.
Okay, there you go. Did you look up anything about William
I didn't.
Apnes?
I should have.
Why don't we just do it right now here live? Because I was going to do this ahead of time and forgot. So he was a minister, writer, and activist of mixed race descent, right? In 1829, he published a book called A Son of the Forest, one of the first autobiographies of a Native American writer. He was part, again, Pequot. Actually, we can get a pronunciation here.
Yeah, we might as well find out.
Pequot.
I was right.
All right. So
If she's right.
If she's right. Are a Native American people of Kentucky, of Connecticut.
Okay.
He was Pequot by descent, especially through his mother's family, and identified with their culture. Later, he was adopted by the Mashpee tribe. In recent decades, his works have been frequently anthologized in collections of American literature. He was an activist on behalf of Native American rights. So here, Dr. Park is comparing Samuel the Lamanite, who was a Lamanite that came and stood upon a wall and preached the Nephites to call them to repentance. That's good history.
Yes.
All right. Further, given the complexity, continuing the quote, given the constantly changing racial complexions in the Book of Mormon, the book demonstrates that race is malleable, a rejection of the growing American conception that racial identities were forever fixed. While many Christians were now positing that the different races were forever separated by biological barriers, Joseph Smith's text introduced the idea of racial fluidity. Though far from systematic or cohesive, the Book of Mormon's theology of race reflected the church's ensuing struggle to develop a consistent approach to non-white bodies. The text promises that God denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. So this was one of the cool insights about the Book of Mormon that I really appreciated. It kind of also goes back to the opening quote from the chapter, which gives that lists of things the Book of Mormon resolves, which was such a cool list, and again written by Alexander Campbell
with some sarcasm.
With some sarcasm in it, right? But infant baptism, ordination, the Trinity, justification, the fall of man. These are serious, difficult religious topics. And the Book of Mormon helps resolve them.
And people who don't read it carefully, like I'm assuming we can include Campbell in this, can tritely say that the Book of Mormon provides solutions to all these, but the closer you read the Book of Mormon, it's complex, and it's not just a checklist of solving problems. I'm reading, once again, one of the brief introductions. This is the one on Helaman, and it compares Helaman chapter, I want to say 12, to one of the King Benjamin chapters of Mosiah, and it shows how Mormon is essentially using the exact same structure to reveal a very different attitude. Like the theology is largely the same, but Mormons, Mormon and King Benjamin talk about people are less than the dust of the earth, but for King Benjamin that's an opportunity to feel hope and gratitude. And for Mormon, it's just like, people suck. And so it's interesting to, everything is, the Book of Mormon complicates things. It does provide solutions to things like, what is the relationship of grace and works? And what about the Trinity? It does suggest things for this, but it's actually not that simple. In fact, I'll bet Alexander Campbell, if he thought that the Book of Mormon solved the Trinity problem, that he thought it solved it in favor of the Trinity, I wager. And, the Book of Mormon, it rewards close attention.
I have the quote for when Martin Harris swapped the stones.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure.
Joseph Smith exclaimed, "All is as dark as Egypt."
I guess, is that a reference to the plague where it's dark, the plague of darkness?
I don't know. That's why I wanted to point it out. It's a funny quote, but I'm not sure.
Well, here's another one. I was reading recently, somebody asked a question to some scholar. What did people say? What did people use as the example of the evilest human before Hitler? Because nowadays, if we want to go all the way, we compare someone to Hitler. Oh, do you know?
I was going to guess Cain.
No, Pharaoh.
Pharaoh,
yeah, from the Exodus story.
Interesting.
Pharaoh was the preeminent evil person until Hitler came around and knocked him off his throne.
The preeminent evil person. Okay, more little bits that I found were interesting. I appreciated the divine rebuke when the 116 pages were lost, right? When Joseph next looked in his stone, he saw a divine rebuke. Is that something that you knew? The words, he looks into his seer stone, and instead of seeing new text to translate, because the 116 pages were lost by Martin Harris, which was the initial translation of the Book of Mormon, right?
Yeah.
he looked inside the seer stone, and it said, although a man may have many revelations and have the power to do mighty works, those who disobey the counsels of God are destined to incur the vengeance of a just God. Right?
Yeah.
And Joseph lost his translation abilities for a little while.
Yeah, and it was a rough time.
Can you imagine looking in that stone? Well, first of all, can you imagine looking in that stone at all?
Full stop.
Full stop.
I think I've reached a point where if there's a revelation from the period around the translation of the Book of Mormon, my default assumption is it came from the seer stone.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's the right assumption to be making, but that's kind of where I've landed.
Well, when he was dictating revelations for the Doctrine and became the Doctrine and Covenants, right? It didn't indicate that he was using the seer stone for those.
I think at some point he stops using the seer stone
Yeah.
and he puts it away.
And I've heard that described as kind of a level up moment for him when he can be a prophet just without a crutch.
Without the stuff.
I don't know if that's true or not. The reason I don't know that it's true or not is because I don't understand the seer stone to begin with.
Yeah, sure. Fair. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Not all the Whitmers were convinced when they saw the original. When they saw the 8 witnesses.
What about the 8 witnesses?
Not all of the Whitmers who were in that list were totally convinced.
Of the 8 witnesses?
Yeah.
I think they were convinced of the plates, but they weren't necessarily convinced of Joseph Smith or the church.
Got it.
In fact, I want to say all of them fell away from the church at some point. But my understanding is none of them ever publicly denied having seen the plates. Although it is true, if God really cared what we thought,
then maybe
they wouldn't all be Whitmers and Smiths.
Right. So here's what it's talking about: the 8th witnesses. The 3 witnesses were Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris. They saw an angel to bring the plates.
Right, but they weren't allowed to touch them.
They weren't allowed to touch them. The 8 witnesses were allowed to hold them and pass them around or whatever, and leaf through them and things like that. From what I understand.
Although they did not see an angel.
Here's the parenthetical quote though from Mark Twain. This is not all were convinced. This is what I'm talking about. The Whitmers. Yes. Mark Twain would later quip, "I could not feel more satisfied and at rest if the entire Whitmer family had testified." I don't understand that quote. Can you explain what he's saying there?
I can. It's a joke.
Okay.
That's the first thing to know. And he's just saying, the fact that 5 Whitmers, 4 Whitmers and a brother-in-law testified, I'm not quite convinced, but I wouldn't be any more convinced if every single Whitmer in the family could testify. That's not adding anything to my belief that the Book of Mormon is worth.
Okay. I think it's fun that we have a couple Mark Twain quotes.
Mark Twain
was aware of the Mormons.
Was totally willing to make fun of the Mormons. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks. I just didn't understand that sentence when I read it. It didn't parse for me. Okay, we're getting close to the end of the things that I wanted to talk about. There's in the Book of Mormon. It relates each individual Antichrist to a specific
that was
person.
Yeah.
Right. So it says the Book of Mormon has several Antichrists, right? And they challenge church authority and teachings. Some of them represented Protestants' enemies during the 1920s.
Right. So it's the 1820s.
The 1820s. Yeah. So
he proposes this.
Ben Park is arguing
parallel.
that there's these analogies.
Yeah.
These Antichrists are specifically
about specific groups at this specific time.
Right? Shem attempts to turn the Nephites away from the truth by lying about Christ's reality, a swipe against groups like Unitarians that failed to prioritize Christ's divinity. Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and he goes through the other ones.
Right.
Nehor was anti-riches.
Well, yeah, and the Catholics who had this reputation for a religion that was based in wealth.
Yeah.
And then Korihor is a deist.
Which, tell me again, deists?
So deists, that's like what Jefferson thought would all be, right? It's sort of the watchmaker theory of the universe. There was a God, but now it just runs according to natural laws, and God is not directly involved.
Okay, I remember that now. I think Jefferson said Unitarian, though. Is that different?
Oh, you're right. He did say Unitarian.
Yeah.
You're right. I just think of him as a deist, but he did say Unitarian.
Okay. And that's against Korihor, right? Who is this interventionist God in organized religion. I thought that was cool. I'd never heard of that before. Book of Mormon is a book for our time. That's one of the things that's argued. These are stories about stuff that mattered. All right, and then towards the end of the book, we start having schisms. Oliver Cowdery, not the end of the book, the end of the chapter.
End of the chapter.
Even towards the 1830s when after the
Yeah.
church was organized.
Oliver Cowdery is calling Joseph Smith to repentance.
Yeah. You need to remove this thing. And then, okay, the last thing I wanted to mention is that the end paragraph goes back and talks about Lucy Mack Smith and explains the reason for the title of the book, a visionary of the chapter, A Visionary Nation.
Oh, the quotation in the letter to her brother and sister?
Yeah.
There have been 300 just added to the church almost daily. More coming almost daily. He's left some stuff out. I'm trying to fill in the gaps from the quotation. All the religious strivings of their family have led up to this moment, her own son's prophetic calling. Theirs was a modern house of Israel directed by a presiding patriarch, yet still caressed by a determined matriarch.
And then her family, Lucy Mack Smith, joined the church, except for Jesse. So her prophecy was actually...
Well, not her siblings never joined the church, but
okay, but
their
her
kids.
Right, but
and Joseph Sr.'s family.
Yeah, but the two trees prophecy, I guess
right.
what I mean.
Yeah.
Or vision. That
Joseph
was
Sr. and his
fulfilled.
brother.
So I thought it was cool how Ben Park structured the chapter, where he started with Lucy Mack Smith and ended it here. And then, of course, the last quote is a fellow that visited Hiram, and who asked if anybody believed in visions, and Hiram responded, "We are a visionary house."
Yes.
So Ben Park's quote is, "The label could have been given to the entire country. America in the 1820s was a visionary nation filled with innovative believers, each proclaiming their own doctrines, detailing their own visitations, some even peddling their own scripture. Joseph Smith was just one of many that sought to capitalize on the moment, even as he laid the foundation for an even more audacious future."
Yes.
Well done. Loved it. And I think it is powerful enough that I kind of want to keep going. So the chapters don't go by a decade, like we mentioned last time.
I could have sworn he said that it was one chapter per decade. That is wrong.
Yep. So there are 10 chapters. That feels like a season's worth of episodes.
And it goes from... So chapter 2 starts at 1831, and chapter 10 ends in the present.
Yeah,
and
20
came out last
but
year.
it's 2012 to the present. So
2012 to the present.
it's
sorry.
like
it's 10 years.
Yeah, so it is that little bit is at least. So I'm looking forward to this trip through Mormon history through the eyes of this historian.
Yeah, please give us your feedback.
Did you have any comments?
Bored to tears today,
Oh, okay.
let us know.
Yeah.
But I think we're at least going to do chapter 2.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into... It makes sense, of course, that foundational stories are the stories we tell the most. Just like Exodus is the defining story for the Jewish people, or, this chapter is the defining story for our people.
You can really see the effects of kind of the Mormon oral tradition on my experience with this chapter, right? Where a lot of the stuff I knew about, but the edges were blurry, right? The details about the treasure, the details about the family, the illnesses that shaped how they interacted with deity, those parts of the stories, you don't necessarily get all of that when you are taught about Joseph Smith in primary. So I think it's cool to find it like this. Can you tell me what you see that's different about this narrative and Saints?
Oh, okay. I think there are a few things that are different. Saints, this may sound insulting, and I don't mean it that way, although a couple of my kids said they're not going to read Saints because of this. It's designed for a broad audience, not necessarily just for people who are college graduates and have enough income to buy expensive one-volume histories. I mean, it's not that expensive, but it's not free.
Yeah.
And so it's written, probably it's aimed at like a 7th, 8th grade reading level, I would say. It's also a lot more narrative in the sense that it picks individual characters to follow that are sort of emblematic of the era and uses them to explain what else is going on and to try to get a diverse number of voices put together. There's less analysis. There's analysis inherently by what they choose to include, but everything in Saints can be footnoted directly to a historical source. And of course, there's a lot of historical sources in Ben Park's book also. I'm not saying there aren't, but what I mean is he's trying to interpret things. Like he's saying, oh, Shem is kind of like the Universalists. So he's doing things like that. That is not happening in Saints. It's just the stories of people as the records capture it. And they don't say it was a dark and stormy night unless the records show it was a dark and stormy night.
Got it.
And so it feels it's kind of like reading a YA novel in a good way.
Saints
is like reading a YA novel. This is like reading a work of academic analysis of history. And I think both are great. I actually really am enjoying reading Saints Volume 3. I think it's terrific, and I'm learning a lot. But it's super accessible. And I actually think this book is pretty accessible too. But if you're not accustomed to reading academic work, it'll take you a little bit longer to get into it. But I think by Saints, by the end of the first paragraph, you'll be like, oh yeah, I'm here for this.
Okay. Well, I'm really enjoying reading American Zion. And looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, chapter 2.
All right. We'd like to thank our person who provided our music, Daniel Foster Smith. If you want to find us, we're on Discord and on Twitter, but Discord seems to be the place where
Discord is where face and hat conversation happens.
Yeah, you can please join us. The link's in the show notes. We, again, if you're new to the show, we cite all of our sources as much as we can by putting a bunch of show notes in the notes. I noticed on the iPhone app, some of the show notes for the last episode of the 6th season were so long, if you don't mind me saying, that they actually got truncated a little bit. But you click on the link and it'll take you to the webpage and it has the full set of notes.
Okay.
Yeah. Spotify was fine, but
Spotify was fine.
Yeah. Also, let us know what you think about the format. We kind of approached this today as we read the chapters. We're going to talk generally about what happened, but we're going to go into the stuff that we found interesting into those details. Let us know if you're not reading the book, if you found that easy enough to follow, or if you think we should give more background as to what we're covering. Give us some feedback. Or if you thought it was fine, then we'd love to hear that too.
That's good too. Yeah, we just don't want you to feel like we are leaving you out in the cold.
Yeah, that's right. And I think is that it? I think that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric.
Hey, Aaron, anytime.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.